So imagine you're happily chewing grass on a wide prehistoric plain. Clearly, you are not you, you're a dinosaur. Choose the dinosaur you want to, right? It can be a raptor, it can be a giganthosaur, and other dinosaurs I can't pronounce actually. But imagine you're a dinosaur. You're the king of the world, right? If you invested in nest space or territory, you're doing pretty well, and then you go extinct. Hey folks, I'm Shrivo and you're watching The Big Buck Show. It's a show where we tell you how you can start your investment journey and, more importantly, how you can turn your small bucks into big bucks. What just happened? You went extinct. Now, why am I talking to you as if you're a dinosaur? And why am I even bringing this up? Yes, this is The Big Buck Show. We do talk about investing. So why on earth is Shubho talking about dinosaurs? There's a simple reason. The reason dinosaurs went extinct is because they did not diversify. They continued to live on one rock. They had one asset, the planet Earth. Now, don't get me wrong, we still have one asset, the planet Earth. But I think we're making some progress, right? Like Bezos going to space, International Space Station, potential manned Mars mission, etc. We are getting, I think, to a point where as a species, we are diversifying. And that's pretty important. So while I can't control what happens to us as the human race, I can draw lessons from this very evident benefit of diversification or the downfalls of not diversifying, which is don't let your portfolio become a dinosaur and go extinct. It's not good for you. The same way it wasn't good for dinosaurs. Diversify. In case you haven't figured out, we're going to talk about diversification on this episode of The Big Buck Show. So hopefully by now, you have figured out that diversification is important. But that's not enough. It's necessary but not sufficient. While you know that diversification is important, lots of people don't know how to diversify or how much to diversify and when to diversify. So let's start with what I think is the simplest question to answer. When should you diversify? The simple answer is now, or rather yesterday. Because there's no point, no matter how big your portfolio is, no matter how old your portfolio is, if you haven't diversified, do it now, right? That's a simple answer. Then your immediate next question is, well, how do I do it? Great, I know I need to, I know I should do it now, but how do I diversify? So there are a couple of dimensions of diversification that you should know. Now, dimensions, big word. Diversification, big word. What I mean is that there are a couple of tips and tricks you need to use so that your portfolio, your investments have a better chance of succeeding. That's about it. So let's look at, what levers you can pull. Firstly, if you're invested in only a few asset classes, what do I mean by asset classes? Stocks, gold, fixed deposits, houses, land. These are all different asset classes. You should make sure that you have a diversified portfolio that reflects your long-term goals, your short-term goals, and you have multiple asset classes in that portfolio. What does that mean? It means you probably should have 2 to 3 asset classes in your portfolio. If you're really young, you could say, great, I'm going to have some balanced long-term equity plays, some individual stocks I'm betting on, and maybe, if you want to take some risk, some crypto. That's a diversified portfolio. You have at least 3 asset classes. If you're older, you might say, hey, I'm going to have some money in a fixed deposit, I'm going to have some bonds, I'm going to have some shares, and I'm investing for a house. I already own a house. You have 4 asset classes, you have different amounts put in it, and that's diversification. What's not okay is to say, man, bro, crypto sahi hai. मैंने तो सारा पैसा उसमें लगा दिया. That is not okay. One asset class is not a good idea, irrespective of risk. So that's dimension 1, kinds of assets. There's a second dimension. What's your time horizon? Are there investments that you're constantly churning, and are there investments you're holding? Typically, that's important because there are some things where constantly looking at it doesn't help. If you're investing in a blue chip company and you think it has great prospects, put the money in, don't look at it, let it ride. unless of course there's significant material adverse news, right? Or you can say, hey, there are some stocks that are quite popular, quite trendy, there's lots of ups and downs, and I'm holding them in the short term. I'm constantly looking at them and deciding whether I want to buy or sell. So there's a diversification of time horizon. That's the second dimension of diversification. There's a third dimension, which is, hey, where am I investing? Not which asset classes, but geography. You could invest in India, you could invest in the US, you could invest in the UK. And why does geography matter? Because geographies give us different risk return exposure. Different geographies in different markets are growing at different rates. They have different companies. Those companies offer differential returns and different risks. So I'll come back to this because I think this is one of the most interesting plays that most people don't make. Then finally, there's a fourth dimension, which is, how am I going to think about my diversification as an individual, which is, where's my job? Where are my investments? Where's my wife or parents' job? So there's also a diversification play to say, in your family unit, right, are you bringing more diversity in? For example, if you have a family in India, but the breadwinner is in Dubai and earning in dirhams, then you have diversification because part of your income stream is in the currency of UAE and the rest of your assets are in India. But most people actually have diversification that's not as widespread as that. Most families are geography based. So this links back to my previous point, which is geographical diversification becomes all the more important because often family units do not have diversification, right? It's not like husband, wife are working in two different countries or working in two completely different types of jobs. They often have more homogeneity, which is they're all in the same market, the same country, same currency. Another way to diversify is to think about industry segments. So which industry segment should you invest in? Actually, the fact is you should not invest in only one industry segment. You should have multiple industry segments that you're investing in. And as you increase the number of industry segments you are invested in, you have more diversification. Now, if you're a beginner and you're thinking, man, I just want to invest in a few stocks, what is this industry segment diversification? Yes, that is hard because you need industry knowledge, you need confidence, you need to actually know what you're doing to have any confidence in saying, I'm going to pick these X industries. So often people forego that and invest in an instrument that gives them diversification, like the index fund we talked about before. So I think I've talked to you about many ways to diversify, and if I were in your shoes, my head might be spinning. So let's recap. There are 5 real ways to diversify. First, is your family unit diversified? Most of us are not. We live in the same country, we live close together, we have the same currency. So that's very hard. Second, do you have asset class diversification? Can you invest in different asset class? I highly recommend that you do, and most people can. Third, time horizon diversification. We talked about this. Do you have different goals? You should have different goals if you don't, and they typically should be over different time horizons, and therefore your investments should also have different time horizons they're tailored to. That gives you time horizon diversification. Fourth, is there diversification of geographies? Which is, again, can you invest in multiple markets? Live in India, can you invest in the US, or can you invest in London? And why is that? Because you're already having a number of investments in your home market. So some portion of your portfolio should be outside your home market. And finally, what I just spoke about, which is industry diversification, which is, hey, make sure you're investing in stocks across different industries. Now, most people ask me, that sounds really complicated. And diversification, while it's a very simple concept, can be complex to execute. I hear you. It is sometimes very complicated. And they say, what should I pick? I'm like, well, it's not a question of what should you pick, it's what's easiest to execute. So for me, obviously asset class diversification is a must. You can't not have it. And it's fairly easy to execute, whether you're a novice or an experienced investor. Second, time horizon diversification. Very important because you can't just be investing for the short term. You have to be able to have assets that you're holding for the long term because often they appreciate the most if you've picked them well. That's super important. And then third for me is geographical diversification because that's something that's most ignored, right? It's the one that people most often don't get to. And I'll come back to it because I want to spend some more time on it. I think the whole point about family unit diversification or diversification of industries is hard because it requires a lot more knowledge. And often I say, look, if you have 3 out of 5 of my diversification dimensions, you're pretty well off, right? And so don't try and do everything. I'll take you back to my principle. Start small, start simple, execute. Again, start diversifying in steps you can actually manage. Keep it simple, but execute. It's more important to diversify along some dimensions than to try and build this complicated diversification strategy and get nothing done, right? Now I'll come back to what most people miss, which is diversification of geographies. And why this is important? Because the biggest influence on returns is not the stock you pick or the asset class you pick, but often the market it's part of, right? Imagine that you're in this huge river and you're trying to swim against the current. I don't know if you have swum in rivers, I have. It's almost impossible to swim against the current. And when you're investing, you're essentially picking which currents you're going to be part of. And so therefore, picking a new market is the most influential and significant decision you can make in terms of impacting your investments. Let's take a period of time. Let's go back to November 2016, right? And I'll give you an India-US example. In November 2016 to let's say Jan 2016, the India market basically dropped by about 10%, right? You can look at NSE, you can look at BSE, doesn't matter. In that same period, the NASDAQ, which is a US exchange, went up the equivalent of 30% per annum. So just imagine, you didn't do anything. You could have just bought the index. And you know what indexes are. If you don't know what indexes are, go back, to the previous episodes in the series and you learn about that. But assuming you do know about indexes, if you had just bought the NSE index, which is the Nifty 50, versus the NASDAQ index, which is the NASDAQ 50, your returns would have been different by 40%. By doing what? By changing your market. Similarly, if you take a longer time period, if you take, let's say, 3 to 5 years, or even a 10-year period, what you'll see on the screen right now is the difference if you had invested in India versus the US. And you must be wondering, why are you talking about the US? Like, do you have like this complex? No, it's nothing to do with that country in particular. It's to do with its market fundamentals and the fact, if you go back to, what Deepthi and I discussed a few episodes ago, it's a market that is extremely deep, has some of the most innovative global companies in the world that typically generate amazing returns because their businesses are amazing. And so I'm not saying just invest in the US, right? Or just invest outside India. Of course not. You're in India. The Indian markets are extremely interesting, but you shouldn't put all your eggs in one geographical market. And why am I bringing this up? Because it's the easiest diversification play to make. You're not trying to figure out different asset class mixes. You're not trying to figure out industry strategy. You're not even trying to figure out different goals. All you're saying is, I'll invest in the market. You can choose the same instrument. Choose the simplest instrument, an index fund. And it does an excellent job of diversifying your risk and improving your return. So that was my take on diversification. If you are not diversified, then I think it's high time you started. If you have zero diversification, which is you haven't even started investing, therefore you can't be diversified, that's even worse, right? So you'd better start investing. But when you do, make sure you're diversifying. And if you have questions, as usual, please post questions in comments and we'll get back to you. And, this is a journey, right? If you have followed the journey with us, we started with where do you start? We talked about a few asset classes, we got some expert advice, and we're now dealing with a core concept, which is how do you continue to make sure your portfolio grows and is healthy. And so I seriously urge you, keep it simple, keep it easy, and execute. That's what you need to do to get your small bucks to be big bucks. Hey folks, thanks for watching the Big Bucks Show. And tell us how you thought about this episode in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel, please, and hit the notification bell so you get a notification next time a video shows up. Also, don't forget to follow us on social media. We have a Twitter channel, a YouTube channel, and of course, also an audio podcast. And hey, continue watching us so that you can turn your small bucks into big bucks.